My husband filed for divorce and told the kids, "Your mother is only herself to blame. She did nothing for 10 years." The kids said nothing. My lawyer handed the judge a USB drive. It contained a video. My husband stood up and asked to stop it. The judge said, "No." Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that a good wife was invisible. Not invisible the way a ghost is, hollow and forgotten, but invisible the way a foundation is. You don't see it. You don't think about it. But pull it out, and the whole house collapses into dust. That's what I told myself during the 10 years I spent building our life in Fairview, Ohio, while my husband, Daniel, built his career in corporate law. I told myself it so many times that I started to believe it was enough, that being the foundation was the same as being valued. We met at Ohio State during our junior year. Daniel was sharp, ambitious, and magnetic in the way that certain men are, the kind of magnetism that feels like warmth until you realize it's actually just heat. He wanted a partner who would support his climb, and I wanted a family, a home, a life that meant something. For a while, those two desires fit together like puzzle pieces. For a while. We married young. I was 24. Daniel was 26. Within 2 years, our daughter Chloe was born, and 18 months after that, our son Ethan arrived. Anyone who has had 2 children in diapers at the same time understands that the word schedule becomes a joke, and the word sleep becomes a myth. I left my position as a marketing coordinator at a mid-size firm in Columbus, not because Daniel demanded it, not with a dramatic ultimatum, but because the math simply didn't work. His salary was 3 times mine. His career had momentum. His firm had a partnership track. Daycare for 2 infants in our county cost more than I brought home after taxes. The decision felt practical, mutual, temporary. Temporary lasted a decade, and during that decade, I did what millions of women do and what almost no one counts. I managed the household finances, every bill, every insurance renewal, every tax document. I coordinated 2 children's medical appointments, school schedules, extracurricular activities, birthday parties, and teacher conferences. I maintained the social relationships that kept Daniel connected, the dinner parties, the holiday cards, the friendships with his colleagues' wives that he needed but never cultivated himself. I renovated the kitchen by managing contractors while Daniel was at a conference in Chicago. I nursed both children through ear infections, broken bones, and the particular emotional chaos of adolescence. I kept records. I kept receipts. I kept a home. What I didn't keep was a salary. And that, I would learn, was the thing that mattered most to Daniel. The first sign came quietly, the way the worst signs always do. It was a Tuesday evening in March, about 14 months before the divorce filing. Daniel came home later than usual, which wasn't unusual, but something about his energy was different. Clipped. Distracted in a way that felt purposeful rather than tired. I asked him how his day was, a reflex, a ritual, and he said fine, without looking up from his phone. I thought nothing of it. I made dinner. I helped Ethan with algebra. I folded laundry. I thought nothing of it. But the next week it happened again, and the week after that. By April, I noticed that Daniel had begun taking his phone to the bathroom. He'd never done that before. By May, he'd changed his phone's passcode, the one I'd known for 6 years, without mentioning it. By June, he was working late 3 nights a week and coming home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine and wasn't his. I told myself there were explanations. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that women who have been home for a decade sometimes project their own anxieties onto innocent behavior. I told myself a lot of things that summer. The real crack appeared in September. Daniel's college friend Marcus came to visit for a weekend, and on Saturday night, after a bottle and a half of red wine, Marcus said something offhand at the dinner table. A reference to a woman named Kristen, some joke about Daniel finally meeting someone who keeps up with him intellectually. Marcus caught himself immediately. His eyes went to Daniel. Daniel's face went blank in that particular way that isn't blankness at all, but calculation. Marcus laughed it off, changed the subject. I smiled and refilled his glass. I said nothing, but I remembered everything. 6 months later, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped our children with homework 1,000 times, and told me he was filing for divorce. He said the marriage had run its course. He said he needed someone who challenged him. He said it with the careful, rehearsed calm of a man who had been planning the conversation for a long time. And then, 2 weeks after that, came the moment I will never forget for the rest of my life. We were in the living room, a meeting Daniel had arranged, supposedly to talk to the kids together like adults. Chloe was 16. Ethan was 14. They sat on the couch in the house they'd grown up in, and their father looked at them with an expression I can only describe as performative sorrow, and he said, "I want you both to understand. Your mother is not blameless here. She chose not to work for 10 years. She contributed nothing financially to this family. What happened to this marriage is something she brought on herself." The children said nothing. They looked at the floor. They looked at their hands. They said absolutely nothing. And I sat there, in my own living room, in the home I had run for a decade, surrounded by the evidence of 10 years of invisible labor, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, not shatter. Shift. Like a foundation deciding it was done being walked on. That night, after Daniel left to stay at what he called a colleague's place, and what I now understood was Kristen's apartment in the short North District of Columbus, I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying in the weeks since he first said the word divorce, enough to understand that tears were a release, not a strategy, and what I needed now was a strategy. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and I started to think. I started to count. Do you know what 10 years of unpaid domestic labor actually costs? I didn't. Not precisely. I knew it in the abstract, the way you know a country exists that you've never visited. So I started researching, and the numbers were staggering. Full-time childcare for 2 children in Ohio averaged $28,000 per year at the time I left work. A household manager, someone who does what I did, coordinating contractors, managing finances, maintaining schedules, ran another $45,000 annually in our market. A personal chef, even a part-time one, would have added $20,000. We hadn't employed any of these people. I had been all of them. Over 10 years, the conservative economic estimate of what I had provided to our household, what had allowed Daniel to bill 60-hour weeks and make partner at his firm by year 7, was somewhere north of $900,000. $900,000. And according to Daniel, I had contributed nothing. I also counted what I stood to lose if I walked into a divorce proceeding unprepared. Ohio is not a community property state, but it is an equitable distribution state, which means the court divides marital assets based on what is fair, a word that, in practice, is shaped by whoever argues most effectively. Our house was worth approximately $480,000, with $210,000 left on the mortgage. Daniel's 401k had approximately $340,000 in it. There were investment accounts, a business interest he'd structured through an LLC 3 years ago, and the question of spousal support. Daniel's annual income at the firm was $310,000. Mine was zero. Had been zero for a decade by mutual agreement, in service of his career. But Daniel had already moved his narrative. He'd told the children I had chosen not to work. He'd framed a decade of sacrifice as a decade of laziness. And if he was already saying that to our children who had watched me every single day, what was he saying to his attorney? I felt the fear then. Properly. The kind of fear that lives in your stomach and doesn't leave when you distract yourself, that waits for you patiently at 3 a.m. The fear of financial ruin. The fear of losing the house my children called home. The fear of being defined, legally and socially, by the story Daniel was already telling about me. The fear of being made invisible one final time, not as a foundation, but as a footnote. But here's the thing about fear. When you've spent a decade managing crises alone, you get very good at feeling it and acting anyway. I gave myself 48 hours to be afraid. I took Chloe and Ethan to school. I went to the grocery store. I cleaned the house. Not because it needed cleaning, but because routine is its own form of armor. I let myself feel the vertigo of a life being pulled apart. And then, on the third morning, I made a list. Not a feelings list, a strategic list. The first item was an attorney. Not any attorney. A family law specialist with a track record in high-asset Ohio divorces. I had already started researching. There was a woman named Patricia Holt at a firm in Columbus with 22 years of experience and a reputation for being, in the words of one online review, the attorney you want and the one opposing counsel fears. I called her office that morning and made an appointment for the following Thursday. The second item was documentation. I had been managing our household finances for 10 years, which meant I had access to, and had personally organized, virtually every financial record our marriage had generated. Bank statements. Tax returns going back to 2014. Investment account statements. The LLC documents Daniel had filed 3 years ago. Credit card records. Mortgage documents. Insurance policies. I had organized all of it in a filing system in our home office. Because that was my job. Because no one else was going to do it. Because that was what the Invisible Foundation did. I began photographing every document with my phone. I created a shared drive with a password Daniel didn't know and uploaded everything. The third item was the harder one. The one I almost didn't write down because writing it down made it real. The camera. In the months before Daniel's confession, before Marcus's slip at the dinner table, before any of it, back when I was still in the stage of telling myself I was being paranoid, I had done something. I'm not proud of the fear that drove me to it, but I am no longer ashamed of it either. I had placed a small home security camera in our living room. I told myself it was for package theft. We'd had a porch theft incident that spring. But I knew, even then, why I was really doing it. The camera had been recording for 9 months. I hadn't looked at most of the footage. I hadn't wanted to know. But now I needed to know, and more importantly, I needed to know what was on it that might matter in a courtroom. I sat down with my laptop and I started to review. It took 3 evenings to get through it all. What I found on that footage would change everything. But first, I had to survive the appointment with Patricia Holt. I had to walk into that office and say out loud, for the first time to someone who could actually help, "My husband is trying to destroy me financially, and I have spent 10 years building evidence that I was here." I had to be ready to fight the way I'd never had to fight before. Not with emotion, not with righteousness, but with facts, with records, and with the quiet, organized ferocity of a woman who has spent a decade paying very close attention to everything. Daniel thought I hadn't been working. He had no idea how hard I was about to work. Patricia Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on High Street in Columbus. The kind of office that communicates, before anyone says a word, that the person behind the desk is not someone you want working against you. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the calm, appraising eyes of someone who had heard every version of every marriage story and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I sat down across from her, put my folder of documents on the table, and told her everything. I told her about the 10 years, about the choice to leave my career, the mutual decision we had made together, the 60-hour weeks I had enabled, the partnership he had made while I managed every moving part of our domestic life. I told her about Kristen, what I suspected but hadn't yet confirmed. I told her about Daniel's statement to the children. I told her about the camera. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what your husband's attorney is going to argue?" "That I chose not to work," I said. "Yes, and that your earning capacity, your potential earning capacity, should factor into any support calculation. They'll pull your old resume, show what you were making in 2014, and extrapolate what you could have earned over 10 years. Then they'll argue that the gap between what you could have earned and what you actually need now is your own responsibility. It's a common strategy. Can it work?" She looked at my folder. "Not with what you've brought me." We spent 2 hours going through documents. Patricia flagged the LLC. Daniel had structured it 3 years ago in a way that routed a portion of his income through a separate entity, which had the convenient effect of reducing his apparent personal income on paper. It was legal. It was also, Patricia said, common in high-earning professionals who anticipate divorce proceedings. The timing, 3 years ago, was interesting. Was there anything happening 3 years ago that might have prompted him to restructure? She asked. I thought about it. 3 years ago, Chloe had been 13, Ethan 11. Daniel had taken a week-long conference trip to San Francisco in October of that year. There may have been someone before Kristen, I said slowly. Patricia made a note. We'll subpoena his financial records from the LLC. If he's been moving money, we'll find it. That first appointment cost me $450 for the 2-hour consultation. I paid it from our joint checking account, which I still had full access to, and which Patricia advised me to document carefully before Daniel could petition to freeze it. Which he would. She was certain of it. He'll move fast once he realizes you have representation, she told me at the door. Get what you need from that account now. Keep records of everything. I drove home from Columbus feeling, for the first time in months, like I had taken a step in the right direction. But I hadn't yet looked at the crucial segment of the camera footage, the section from a Saturday in November that I had flagged during my review because something about it had made my stomach drop before I'd even processed what I was seeing. That evening, after the children were in bed, I made myself watch it. On that November Saturday, Daniel had been home alone. He thought I was at my sister Rachel's house with the kids, a day trip we'd taken for my niece's birthday party. We had come home 2 hours earlier than planned because Ethan had developed a headache. I had sent the kids upstairs to rest and come through the kitchen door myself, and then, I now remembered, Daniel had appeared from the direction of the living room looking startled, and I had thought nothing of it at the time. The camera showed why he'd been startled. He had not been alone. A woman, blonde, mid-30s, in a way that was deliberate, sat on our living room couch. My couch. In the house I had kept for 10 years. She was on her phone when the door opened. She stood quickly when she heard the noise. Daniel came from the hallway, also moving fast, saying something I couldn't hear clearly. But I could read his posture. Alarm. Containment. The practiced calm of a man who knows how to manage a situation. The woman left through the front door within 40 seconds. Daniel straightened the couch cushion, a specific small gesture that told me everything, and went to the kitchen. 2 minutes later, I walked through the back door. I sat with that footage for a long time. It wasn't just evidence of infidelity. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, so adultery doesn't automatically change the asset division. But it was proof that he had brought a woman into our marital home. It established a timeline. It contradicted his narrative. Because if this had been happening for years, then our marriage had not run its course due to mutual incompatibility. It had been deliberately ended by him, unilaterally, while I had continued to fulfill every obligation we had agreed upon. And there was something else on that footage. Something that would matter more than the woman's presence. Near the end of the recording, before he heard the door, Daniel had been on a phone call. The camera's audio was imperfect, but clear enough, and I heard him say distinctly, "We can restructure the Meridian account before she has any idea what I've moved. She doesn't look at that level of detail." He was wrong about that. He was so profoundly wrong about that. I clipped the audio. I sent it to Patricia's secure email that night. Her response arrived at 7:14 the next morning. "This changes our approach significantly. We need to meet again this week. Do not discuss this with anyone, including your children. We may be looking at financial fraud in addition to asset concealment." I read that email 3 times. Then I thought about what Daniel had said to our children. "Your mother contributed nothing." And I thought about how he had stood in our living room, in the home I had run for 10 years, and decided that the woman he had brought into it and the money he had moved out of it were both things I would never discover. He had underestimated me. That was his first real mistake. The plan, as Patricia and I had structured it over 3 subsequent meetings, was methodical, not dramatic, not emotional. Methodical. First, we retained a forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Marsh, whom Patricia had worked with on previous cases involving income concealment through business entities. Sylvia's job was to trace the money that had moved through Daniel's LLC over the previous 3 years and establish whether there were marital assets he had deliberately failed to disclose. Patricia was careful to explain to me that this process would take time and money, but that if Daniel had done what we suspected, the results would significantly affect the court's perception of his credibility. Second, I filed a formal motion for temporary spousal support. Ohio courts can order temporary support during divorce proceedings to preserve the financial status quo, and given the income disparity, $310,000 on his side, 0 on mine, Patricia was confident we would receive it. Filing that motion was the moment the divorce stopped being Daniel's orderly exit and became something else entirely. Third, I served Daniel with our discovery requests. The moment those papers arrived at his attorney's office, a man named Gerald Weiss, senior partner at a downtown Columbus firm, the kind of attorney you hire when you expect to win, everything shifted. I was in the Kroger on Maple Street when my phone rang. It was Daniel. I almost didn't answer. Then I decided I would, because I had learned that in a conflict like this one, information is everything, and even an angry phone call from the other side tells you something. "What are you doing?" His voice was controlled, but barely. "Sylvia Marsh? You hired Sylvia Marsh?" "I hired a forensic accountant, yes." "You are making this so much harder than it needs to be." "We had agreed." "We hadn't agreed to anything, Daniel." A pause, long enough to be meaningful. "Weiss says the discovery request is overly broad. We're going to object." "That's Gerald's right," I said. Patricia anticipated that. Another pause. "I want to meet, not attorneys, just us. I think we can resolve this reasonably if you stop." "I'm in the middle of something," I said. "Have Gerald contact Patricia." I hung up. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. What didn't surprise me was what came next, because Patricia had warned me it might. Daniel and Gerald filed a counter motion arguing that my temporary support request was excessive and that I had voluntarily reduced my earning capacity by choosing not to work. Exactly the argument Patricia had predicted. They also filed a motion to limit the scope of Sylvia's financial investigation on the grounds that the LLC was a separate business entity, not subject to marital asset review. But it was the other thing that arrived, not through the attorneys, but through Kristen, that I hadn't anticipated. I don't know how she got my personal email address. I don't want to know. But 3 weeks into the formal proceedings, I received a message from an address I didn't recognize. It was 2 sentences long. You should know that Daniel has already spoken to a judge he knows socially. You are going to lose this. Walk away now, and you'll get more than if you fight. I forwarded it to Patricia within the hour. Patricia's response was carefully worded, but I could feel the controlled fury underneath it. This was potential witness tampering, potential corruption allegation. She told me to preserve everything and not respond. The threat, intended to frighten me into retreat, had instead handed us another card. I still had the most important card, though: the flash drive. I had been sitting on the November footage and the audio clip for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Patricia had advised against revealing it too early. Discovery requests are a strategic process, and the goal was to let Daniel and Gerald believe that our case rested primarily on the financial documentation, so that when the footage emerged, its impact would be maximized. But Daniel and Kristen's escalation forced our hand slightly earlier than planned. Patricia filed a supplemental disclosure the following week, notifying the court that we possessed audiovisual evidence relevant to the proceedings, including evidence of potential financial misconduct. She did not describe the contents in detail. Gerald Weiss called Patricia the same afternoon. According to Patricia, he asked, quite specifically, what was on the recording. Patricia told him the court would see it at the appropriate time. What happened next told me everything about what Daniel and Kristen feared that recording contained. Daniel drove to the house. Not our house. I had effectively been living there with the children, and he had his Columbus apartment. But he came anyway, rang the doorbell on a Wednesday evening like a stranger, and when I opened the door, he looked like a man who had not slept in several days. I need to know what's on that drive, he said. You were there, I said. You tell me. Sarah. He used my name like a key that no longer fit the lock. This isn't... I never wanted it to get to this point. The kids don't. I said it quietly. Don't use the children right now, Daniel. They're in the next room. He dropped his voice. I can offer you the house. Full title. No contest. Just drop the forensic audit. We settle this privately. I looked at him for a moment. The man I had built a life with. The man who had told my children I'd done nothing for 10 years. Have Gerald call Patricia, I said, and I closed the door. That night, I ran a bath, poured a glass of wine, and sat in the quiet of my own house for an hour. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired and sad and certain. There's a particular strength that comes from grief that has finished turning into resolve. I had been afraid of this fight. I had sat at that kitchen table at 2 a.m, counting losses, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I took 4 days. I took the children to see my sister Rachel in Cincinnati for a long weekend. We visited the zoo. We ate too much ice cream. Ethan laughed properly for the first time in weeks. Chloe put her head on my shoulder in the car on the way home and said, Mom, are we going to be okay? Yes, I said. And I meant it. When we got back from Cincinnati, the house felt different. Quieter in a way that wasn't emptiness but space. The space you discover when you stop filling it with someone else's unease. I went through the mail, watered the plants Rachel had taken care of while we were gone, and sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee and my laptop. 2 emails from Patricia. A voicemail from Weiss's office that Patricia had already flagged. Nothing from Daniel directly, which meant he was now working entirely through legal channels, which meant their next move would be different. It came on a Thursday, through a channel I hadn't expected. Daniel's mother, Barbara. Barbara Morrison was a woman who had always treated me with the particular warmth of someone who appreciated what I did for her son, while never quite letting me forget that her son was the center of the story. She'd been polite, sometimes genuinely kind, but she was, at her core, Daniel's mother. And in this conflict, that meant she was not neutral. She called and asked if she could come for tea. I said yes, because I knew what the visit was about, and I thought it was better to have that conversation in my own home, on my own terms, where I could think clearly. She sat at my kitchen table on Friday afternoon and told me, in her soft, measured way, that she was worried about everyone involved. About Daniel. About the children. About me. She said she thought that litigation was destructive to all parties and that she hoped I would consider a more collaborative approach. She said Daniel had told her I was being unreasonably aggressive and that he truly wanted what was best for Chloe and Ethan. I listened. I offered her more tea. I did not raise my voice. When she finished, I said, "Barbara, I appreciate that you're worried. I want you to know that I love your grandchildren, and everything I'm doing is to make sure they are provided for. Daniel is welcome to pursue a collaborative resolution through our attorneys at any time." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "He says you have something on a recording that could hurt him. He says it's not what you think." There it was. I kept my expression perfectly calm. "Barbara, I'm not able to discuss the details of the proceedings. I'm sure you understand." She left 20 minutes later. I sat at the table for a long moment after I heard her car pull out of the driveway, and then I called Patricia. "His mother came," I said. A beat of silence. Then, "Of course she did. What did they want?" "For me to drop the forensic audit, I think. They tried to frame it as concern for the family." "Are you wavering?" "No," I said. "I just wanted you to know." Patricia said something then that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Sarah, the people who are closest to you right now are going to tell you that the simplest path is the kindest one. They'll tell you to settle, to forgive, to think about the children. And some of them will mean it sincerely. But in my experience, women who settle in situations like yours don't get peace. They get poverty with less conflict. Remember that." I remembered it. What I needed, I had realized during those days in Cincinnati, was not just legal firepower. I needed people around me who understood what I was actually going through, not as an abstract matter of legal strategy, but as a human experience. My sister Rachel was part of that. She had been calling every few days, checking in, asking what she could do. But I also needed something more structured. A friend from my old marketing job, Donna Chen, had mentioned, years ago, when I'd run into her at a farmer's market, that she'd gone through a divorce and had found a support group helpful. I had mentally filed it under something other people need. I pulled it out now. The group met Tuesday evenings at a community center in Westerville. 8 women at various stages of separation or post-divorce life. I went the first Tuesday after we returned from Cincinnati and sat in a plastic chair in a fluorescent-lit room and listened to someone else tell a version of my story, and something happened to my chest that I can only describe as unlocking. You can be doing everything right, hiring the right attorney, building the right case, holding yourself together for your children, and still be desperately lonely inside the strategy. That group gave me a place where the strategy could come off for an hour. I kept going. Every Tuesday. Those women, their stories, their survival, their humor about the absurdity of it all, were an anchor. Meanwhile, Daniel and Gerald were watching. I knew they were watching because Patricia told me their requests for extensions were becoming more frequent, a pattern she recognized as stalling. Sylvia Marsh had already found 3 years of income redistribution through the LLC that, in her professional opinion, constituted deliberate concealment of marital assets. The Meridian account Daniel had mentioned on the recording had received $87,000 in transfers over 28 months. $87,000. Moved quietly, systematically, while I folded laundry and helped with algebra, and renewed the car insurance, and believed that we were building something together. I didn't tell Daniel's mother any of this when she came for tea. I offered her shortbread and spoke in measured sentences, and showed her nothing of what I knew. That, I had learned, was its own kind of power. It was a Saturday in late April when they both came. Daniel and Kristen. I hadn't expected that. Daniel, I might have predicted. Another doorstep conversation, another attempt to negotiate around the attorneys. But Kristen? That was a miscalculation on their part, and I think I understood it in the first second she stepped out of his car and walked up the driveway of my house. This wasn't a peace offering. This was theater. This was Daniel trying to reframe the narrative one more time, to present himself as the reasonable man with the new partner, the forward-looking couple who just wanted resolution, and to present me as the obstacle. They rang the doorbell together. I had seen the car from the upstairs window and had already taken a slow breath. I went downstairs. I opened the door. Kristen was younger than I expected. Early 30s, not mid, and more nervous than she'd probably intended to appear. She was dressed carefully, in the kind of studied casual way that communicates effort while pretending not to. Daniel was in weekend clothes, hands in his pockets, projecting relaxed reasonableness. "We were hoping we could talk," he said. "All three of us. Like adults." I looked at them both for a moment. Is this what he thought would work? Bringing her to my door? "The children are home," I said. "They're old enough to understand that adults can have civil conversations." "They're 16 and 14, I said. "And they're not part of this conversation. Give me a moment." I sent Chloe and Ethan to the neighbor's house. I'd developed a contingency for situations that might upset them, and this qualified. Then I let Daniel and Kristen into the living room, because I was not going to have this conversation on my front porch where the neighbors could see, and because I wanted to hear what they'd come to say. What followed was 40 minutes of the most sophisticated manipulation I have ever experienced in person. Kristen spoke more than I'd anticipated. She had clearly prepared. She said she understood this situation was painful. She said she had no desire to displace me in my children's lives. She said she admired what I had built and respected the role I had played. Every sentence was constructed to position herself as the empathetic, reasonable party, and to position me, by contrast, as the one who was prolonging conflict unnecessarily. And then came the core of it. Daniel leaned forward and said, very quietly, "Sarah, what you have on that recording, I'm asking you, woman to woman with Kristen here, as someone you've known for over a decade, to think about what releasing it would do to everyone, to the kids, to my career, to the life we built together. I'm prepared to offer you a settlement that is more than generous. Full equity in the house, 18 months of transitional support, a clean separation. I'm asking you not to go to war." He was asking me not to go to war, after he'd already fired the first shot, after he'd moved $87,000, after he'd told my children I had done nothing. "How generous?" I said. I wanted to hear the number. He named it. And the number, I'll say this for him, was not insulting. It was real money. The house equity alone was $270,000. 18 months of support at a rate that would give me time to rebuild. It was the kind of offer that, if I had walked into this fight without Patricia, without Sylvia, without the recording, might have felt like the most I could hope for. But I did have Patricia, and Sylvia, and the recording, and the Meridian account, and the understanding that what Daniel was trying to avoid wasn't discomfort. It was accountability. That number wasn't generosity. It was a price tag on his protection. "I'll have Patricia review any formal offer Gerald submits," I said. Kristen's careful composure cracked, just slightly. "Sarah, I want you to think about what this looks like for your children. If this goes to a full hearing, if that recording comes out—" "Kristen?" I said her name gently, but with a clarity that stopped her. "I appreciate that you've prepared what you wanted to say today, but I think you both need to leave now." Daniel stood. The relaxed reasonableness was gone. What replaced it was something colder and, in its way, more honest. "You are making a mistake," he said. "The offer goes away the moment we walk out that door." "Then I guess it goes away," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, the look of a man recalculating, realizing that the variable he had underestimated is larger than he thought. Then he turned and walked out. Kristen followed, without another word. I closed the door, leaned against it. The fear came then, brief, real, the specific cold fear of having just closed a door on a significant sum of money and said no out loud. What if I was wrong? What if the recording wasn't enough? What if the judge favored Daniel despite everything? What if I had just overplayed my hand? I let the fear sit for exactly as long as it needed to. And then I thought about that kitchen table at 2 a.m. I thought about Ethan's face when his father told him I'd done nothing. I thought about the Meridian account. I thought about what Patricia had said about women who settle. I picked up my phone and called her. "They came," I said. "Both of them, with an offer." "What did you say?" "I said to submit it formally through Gerald." A pause. Then, warmly, "Good. Because we're ready, Sarah. We are completely ready." The hearing was on a Wednesday in June. I wore the navy blazer I'd bought the week before, not because I thought the judge would care about my blazer, but because Patricia had taught me that every detail in a courtroom is a form of communication, and I wanted to communicate. I am here. I am prepared. I am not going away. Chloe and Ethan were at school. Rachel had offered to come, but I asked her to be on standby instead. Close enough to reach, far enough that her presence in the gallery wouldn't add an emotional charge to a proceeding I needed to keep purely strategic. I went in with Patricia, with Sylvia's report in the folder, and with a flash drive in my attorney's inside pocket. Daniel and Gerald were already at their table when we entered. Daniel was in a charcoal suit. He looked tired in the particular way that people look when they haven't been sleeping because they are afraid. Kristen was not in the courtroom. Gerald had advised against it, I suspected. But I knew she was nearby, waiting. The judge was the Honorable Margaret Calloway, mid-60s, 23 years on the family court bench. Patricia had told me about her, rigorous, unsentimental, and known for asking the questions that attorneys least want to answer. I looked at her and thought, good. The first hour was procedural, both sides presenting their positions on asset division. Gerald was polished and methodical. He emphasized Daniel's LLC as a legitimate business structure, minimized the transfers identified by Sylvia as routine business expenses, and framed my 10-year career gap as evidence of employability, not sacrifice. He projected an income calculation on a screen. What I would have earned over the decade if I had continued working, which he used to argue that I had not, in fact, given up anything, because I could have done both. Patricia let him finish. Then she stood up, and I watched her dismantle it. She called Sylvia Marsh to the stand. Sylvia, who held a Ph.D. in forensic accounting from Ohio State and had testified in over 200 divorce proceedings, walked the court through 3 years of LLC transfers with the quiet authority of someone who has spent her career making numbers tell the truth. She identified the Meridian account. She traced the $87,000. She showed the pattern, not random business variance, but systematic, recurring, timed transfers, beginning 3 years ago. She had documents. Gerald objected to the characterization. Judge Calloway overruled it. Daniel wrote something on a notepad and pushed it to Gerald. I couldn't see what it said, but Gerald's jaw tightened slightly. Then Patricia said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present Exhibit 7. She produced the flash drive. Gerald was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was disclosed late in the discovery process, and opposing counsel has not had adequate time." "Ms. Holt," said Judge Calloway, "when was this disclosed?" "6 weeks ago, Your Honor, in our supplemental filing. Mr. Weiss's office confirmed receipt." The judge looked at Gerald. "Is that accurate?" A beat. "We received the supplemental filing, yes, but the content was not sufficiently described for us to assess. The filing described audiovisual material relevant to both the marital timeline and financial disclosures," Patricia said. "The rules require disclosure. They do not require us to preview our argument." Judge Calloway looked at Gerald for another moment, in the way that judges look at attorneys who are trying to run out the clock. "Overruled," she said. "Proceed, Ms. Holt." The drive was connected to the court's display system. Patricia played the November footage. The courtroom was very quiet. On the screen, the living room I had kept for 10 years. The woman on the couch, Daniel entering, the 40-second exit, the cushion straightened, and then the phone call. Daniel's voice, clear enough despite the imperfect audio. "We can restructure the Meridian account before she has any idea what I've moved. She doesn't look at that level of detail." Silence. I watched Daniel's face in the moment after the audio ended. I had wondered, many times, what that moment would look like. I had wondered if he would hold it together, if he would maintain the careful, practiced calm that had carried him through years of negotiations and board meetings and courtroom performances. I had wondered if he was, ultimately, better at this than me. He was not. He stood up. "I'd like to, Your Honor, I need to—" He stopped. Started again. "That recording doesn't represent Mr. Morrison," said Judge Calloway in a tone that ended sentences. "Please sit down and allow your attorney to address the court." Gerald touched Daniel's arm. Daniel sat. But the damage was done. Not just the evidence itself, but that moment, that unraveling, that brief loss of the composed exterior that had carried his entire narrative. She contributed nothing. She brought this on herself. The man who had said those things to his children was now sitting in a courtroom, having stood up to protest evidence of his own words, and then been told to sit down. Gerald spent the next 30 minutes attempting to contextualize the audio. Business restructuring, not concealment. Legitimate tax strategy. Taken out of context. He was technically capable and tried very hard. But the audio was what it was, and Sylvia's numbers were what they were, and the footage was what it was. When you are in a courtroom and the facts are arranged correctly, there is a point where performance stops mattering. After the recess, Daniel asked for a private conference with Gerald and Patricia. I waited in the hallway outside with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, listening to the building's ventilation hum, thinking about nothing in particular. Patricia came out 22 minutes later. She looked at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Something between professional satisfaction and the pleasure of a woman who has done this for 22 years and still feels it when justice lands where it should. "He wants to settle," she said. "Our terms." I looked at her. "Our terms. Our terms," she said. "All of them." Our terms, as Patricia and I had structured them over months of preparation, were not vindictive. They were precise. That distinction matters. Vindictive terms are driven by anger and often collapse under legal scrutiny. Precise terms are driven by facts, are defensible at every point, and leave no room at all. The settlement agreement, which Daniel signed 6 days after the hearing, 6 days in which Gerald walked him through exactly what a full trial would look like, given the recording, the financial documentation, and his moment of unraveling in front of Judge Calloway, contained the following terms. The house transferred to me in full. No buyout, no shared equity arrangement. Full title, free and clear. Chloe and Ethan would continue to live in the home they had grown up in the school district they had always attended, with the parent who had been their primary caregiver for 10 years. The children didn't have to change one single thing about their daily life. That mattered more to me than any dollar figure. Daniel's 401k was divided 60-40 in my favor, approximately $204,000 to me. Patricia had argued, successfully, that the account had been built during years when my unpaid domestic labor had subsidized his earning capacity, and that the economic value of that labor, the $900,000 figure I had calculated at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, more than justified the division. The Meridian account funds, $87,000 in documented concealed marital assets, were returned to the marital estate in full and divided equally. Plus interest. Sylvia had calculated the interest. Spousal support, $4,500 per month for 5 years, not 18 months. 5 years, at a rate that reflected both the length of the marriage and the career I had sacrificed. Child support was calculated on Daniel's real income, including the amounts documented through the LLC, and a portion of my legal costs, including the forensic audit, was redirected from Daniel's side, as the court found that his concealment had necessitated the entire investigation. When I read the final settlement document, I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something quieter, relief so deep it resembled exhaustion, and beneath it, a sadness that doesn't disappear even when you win. The marriage was still over. My children still had a father who had tried to reduce their mother's decade of sacrifice to a liability. That doesn't heal the day you sign the papers. But I also felt certain that I had not allowed the story to be written for me. That when someone had stood in my living room and told my children I was worthless, I had responded, not with helplessness, not with vengeance, but with 10 years of evidence arranged in precisely the right order. Patricia called me from her office on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the backyard pulling weeds from the flower beds I had planted the spring Ethan was born. Late afternoon light, a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood, everything completely ordinary and completely mine. "It's done," she said. "Thank you," I said, and meant it in a way I don't have words for. When Chloe and Ethan came home that evening, dropping backpacks, asking what was for dinner, I looked at them in the kitchen I had fought for and felt the answer to every question I'd asked myself at 2 a.m. This is what it was for. The first year after the settlement was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, but because rebuilding looks nothing like the movies suggest. It's slower, more uncertain. It's waking up in your house and realizing the silence is yours now. It's learning, at 40, how to exist in a life whose shape you get to choose. I went back to work. I reached out to Donna Chen, who had become a marketing director at a Columbus e-commerce company, and she connected me with a freelance contract that could become permanent. I took it. I worked from home 2 days a week, which meant I was there when the children got back from school. By the end of the second year, I was permanent. By the end of the third, I'd been promoted twice. The house became fully itself, not because I changed it dramatically, but because the atmosphere shifted. There is a specific peace that comes from a home where no one is managing anyone else's fragility, and I hadn't understood until it arrived how much energy I had spent maintaining the emotional weather for Daniel's benefit. Ethan started laughing at dinner again. Chloe started bringing friends over on weekends. The house got noisier and lighter. I started running, badly, and then adequately. I kept going to the Tuesday group until I didn't need it to hold me together anymore, which is the best thing a support group can become. optional. Rachel and I grew closer than we'd been since childhood. I met a man named James, a landscape architect, quiet and direct and genuinely funny. We took it slowly. By the 5th year, we were not slow anymore. As for Daniel and Kristen, I learned what I learned without seeking it. They married the year after the divorce. Within 18 months, mutual friends reported tensions. Kristen had discovered that Daniel's financial habits didn't change with the partner. They were a personality trait. His professional trajectory slowed significantly. The forensic audit had left a trail his firm could not entirely overlook. The partnership momentum stalled. Kristen's consulting practice struggled. The life she had imagined, constructed in some part at my expense, required more maintenance than attraction. Daniel was not a different man with a different woman. He was the same man. I said nothing about any of this to anyone who didn't already know. In the summer of the 5th year, Chloe graduated high school with a full merit scholarship to the University of Michigan. We celebrated in the backyard. James was there. Rachel was there. The yard was full and loud and luminous. At some point, I stood at the edge of the patio and looked at all of it, and I thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table at 2 a.m, counting losses. She had done well. She had done more than well. The lesson was never about revenge. It was about evidence, about knowing the value of your invisible work before someone tells you it has none. I spent 10 years paying attention. That attention saved me. If someone is telling you, or your children, that you contributed nothing, ask yourself, what have I actually built? What have I kept? What do I know? Count it. All of it. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this if it meant something to you. Thank you for listening.